Hello and welcome to the Moody Meeple Podcast, a podcast all about the wonderful world of tabletop gaming. My name is Steve and I'm joined with Dragon, David and Tom, and today we're going to be talking about what makes board gaming such a great hobby. Hope you enjoy. So, what makes tabletop gaming, board gaming, such a great hobby? It's quite a big question, so hopefully we're going to have an interesting conversation today. We've already had an interesting conversation about how exactly we wanted to word the title of this podcast, so hopefully it could be quite an interesting one. Does anyone want to start us off with any particular thoughts?
I'd like to, if I may. The human race has pretty much had a lot of interest in telling stories and gaming throughout history. It's pretty much ingrained in the history of humankind. And with gaming, you actually have the ability, in some cases, to tell stories. Now, I've been looking through various historical blogs and entries and things like that. And one of the entries I came across is for the royal game of Ur, which was actually came up, invented about 2,500 BCE. And there's many little stories about how this game was set up. And it was supposed to be about how people leave the house, go through the market to their stronghold, get the money, and then go back through the market to spend it and then escape through the city. And you're telling this story as you're playing the game. But it's not just you against playing the game. You are up against an opponent. So you are actually interacting with the whole story itself, playing the game. Now, we can take this a bit further in the fact that we've had role-playing games for many, many years. Now, the concept, as I'm sure you're all aware about RPGs, is you've basically got an open platform to do with whatever you want, with the GM controlling the whole game. So you're creating a story. But with board games, you're actually limiting it to a set of codified rules. So everybody is playing under the same rule set, the same system. So everybody is equal in the actual game system itself. But not everybody is equal in terms of experience in playing these things. So you're actually learning, you're expanding on a game, you're getting better at it, you are improving your mental abilities, and in some case physical abilities, moving pieces around on the board, and you're having fun. You're interacting with a group of people. Not only while you're playing, you're actually talking, telling jokes, and actually enjoying people's company whilst being involved in all these games. And the human history has really had a lot of this kind of interaction over the millennia that humans have been around on this planet. And I think modern board gaming is just an extension of that. Am I wrong?
No, I would say you're not. The Royal Game of Ur, actually, I think it's worth saying. It's there's quite a good video, a few videos, I think, of Irving Finkel, who's like a leading he's like a leading historian, right? In sort
He's
of
one of the
ancient,
historians at the British Museum, yes.
yeah. And there's a few good videos of him playing on YouTube. I think for National Board Game Day a few years ago, he played against Tom Scott, and it's sort of like I would describe it as a sort of backgammon-like game, Royal Game of Ur, which but yeah, super interesting hearing about the history of that, and completely agree that it's definitely something that's always been a part of our sort of human nature, I suppose. The rules aspect I wanted to actually pick up on a little bit, because I find it interesting. You talked about how everyone is equal, and
Well, the game is equal.
the game is equal.
Not everybody playing it is equal because you've got people who are more experienced or you've got novices to the game. And it's pretty much a case of when you first start playing a game, you don't know enough of the little tricks to how to make it work, but you're learning just by playing it.
Now, I would slightly challenge, and I think this is one of the good things about board games and tabletop games in general is their sort of versatility and like how many different types there are. I think you're very much talking, I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, very much from a sort of strategic point of view and sort of strategy games, and the fact that there's an element of you need experience to build up what makes a good strategy or what makes a good play. But there are games that don't necessarily have that. There's board games that rely on chance, just like any other sort of card games and gambling games that we've had in history. But there's also games that do rely almost solely on, and I know this isn't your favourite type of game, Dragon, but it's worth mentioning that there is games that rely on imagination, and that's not
Like
just
Dixit.
well, like Dixit, like Mysterium, and some of the games made by I forget the name of the publishing company, but it's a French company. Sorry about that. I'll put it in the description. But also I think we've played a game called Once Upon a Time. Gloom as well is a very good one that plays on imagination. So I was going to say not
But that
necessarily
kind of,
argue with you, but like there's I think there's almost a broader range to it
but
than
that
that.
takes us back to the storytelling aspect, because with Once Upon a Time, you're actually telling a story based on how the cards come up. So you've got the interaction there with all the storytelling and with the cultural experience that goes along with those kind of games.
Yeah, I can see that. I'd say board games kind of fit into a few categories, including ones which build up creativity, like you're talking about games that are focused on your imagination and building up stories. You also have ones which are building up skills and team working. The cooperative games are a good example of that, where they're building up your ability to work with others in different ways to try and strategize a solution together rather than doing it as an individual. So I think there are like those aspects about uh, board gaming that it really enhances your mental well-being and your mental state. When we talk about creative games, that's great for kind of working on different parts of your brain function, but it's also working on your happiness, right? You're working on your creative well-being. I believe, at least, and this may not be true, but I believe it makes you a happier person.
I think it's proven that it releases endorphins, which, if you wanted a scientific reason as to why it makes you happy, but yeah.
Well, just going through the Wikipedia entry on board games, there's actually a section in there into research into gaming, and they've actually stated that gaming can help for example, with children to help with number skills and numerical estimations and things like that. And then it's also at the end of the scale, it helps with the elderly and reduces the risks of dementia and things like that. So it it has a whole range of impacts across the whole agehood of humans. Agehood, is that really a word?
It is
It,
now.
It is now.
it
Okay.
goes. It
I feel
goes. I
like
mean, there's
part of the
so
reason why there's so much variation within board gaming, but also the reason why it's so useful in a lot of those scenarios is that I feel like a lot of games are sort of abstract simulations of different parts of the human experience. So, like you mentioned earlier about the game of and how that involved, going to the market and things, and there are games that capture all sorts of things like gardening or going to war or anything you could name really. And I think part of what makes it so exciting is that I guess like storytelling, I suppose it's a I don't know or an engine I guess for simulating aspects of the human experience. And I guess part of what's really exciting about that is, I mean, you touched on um, how games can make people happy, but I've definitely experienced a lot of other emotions while playing games as well, like frustration or excitement or any number of things. And I think that because there's that space for it to draw on so many different ideas, it can lead to so many different experiences. And I think that's really cool.
And that's really good. And you can, yeah, like you said, you can really see that why that would be beneficial in sort of day-to-day life, right? It's like board games are chock full, with better ways to communicate, or with co-op games, or it's filled with, you have to think, 5 steps ahead, so you have to be patient while simultaneously working out what kind of plan that you need to make and execute, importantly, and that although there is like a simulation where it's sort of it does sort of simulate some kind of real task or reality, there's also that underlying just sort of mechanic which can help with just basic brain function or maths. It can help with mental maths or anything like that, which I think
Let's face it, we're a bunch of programmers, so what's quite important to us is problem solving and pattern matching. And board games have that in abundance. I think that's probably what draws us particularly to board games, but it's also very helpful for learning to code. I've got a few board games that teach sequences and loops and things like this that my kids play, and it is great to see them programming mice and mazes and things like that. It's just that experience that we can share together, and we play together, and we help each other in building those up, and it really strengthens our relationships. I'm not just talking about my family here. I'd say you three guys, it's strengthened our relationships, right? Dragon, Tom, before we played board games, I didn't know you guys. Same with Steve. Actually, I knew Steve before we worked together, and I feel it helped us work out any differences that we had outside of the board gaming landscape quite amicably. Whereas maybe if we hadn't built up this camaraderie from playing tabletop together, we might have had a different outlook on each other.
And indeed, probably a different outlook on life itself.
Yeah, I was gonna say actually that there is although it's very true that it does help with very practical things like programming, etc. There is, again, going back to the sort of imagination stuff, there is an element of escapism to it, and the game that instantly comes to mind for me is Fog of Love. Obviously, I'm not sure if any of you have played it, but it's a probably isn't Dragon's cup of tea. Let's put it that way. But it's very much it's very imagination based, but it's also you've created these sort of characters and you're building a relationship between these two characters, right? But simultaneously, you can kind of build a relationship with whoever you're playing with, and that doesn't necessarily have to be like an amorous relationship, but it's sort of implied, and it's, although yes, I am a programmer and I do like strategy games where I have to sort of work something out, the games like that and games like, again, Dixit and etc. provide me with a whole nother different type of enjoyment, especially when those types of games tend to be more accessible for non-regular players, and as we've said before, the more people you can get to play your games that enjoy it, then normally the better.
Definitely, the more accessible the game, the more chance I have of getting my other family members to play it. We were playing Potion Explosion earlier today, and that is it does have the problem solving and pattern matching and things like that, but it's also a very cute looking game. It has marbles, it has that whole cascade thing going on. It's the perfect game to play with my small children, my parents, my wife. She came over, had a look at it, she thought it was kind of cool, and it's those things. It's that tactile sensation you get from playing those games, and certain games at least that can bring the occasional player to come over and maybe want to try it out, experiment with it. Whereas some of the more abstract thought-led games are not necessarily as accessible and not necessarily going to be enjoyed by all.
And that kind of leads on to the fact that there's pretty much a board game that out there for anyone. You know, you can. So some people might not necessarily refer to themselves as, regular gamers like we are, but then play backgammon or chess or Monopoly or whatever quite regularly, which isn't necessarily our games of choice always, but it's still it's accessible to pretty much anyone and any age, and it's also accessible almost all of the time. Like generally, not all the time. Cthulhu Wars, but generally most games are sort of transportable and playable in most places, which make them great sources of entertainment when whatever the weather, for instance, rainy days is a classic one. Yeah.
I think I've mentioned before that I've used games as a team building exercise at work. I used Tesoro really as one of the main ones because that allows 8 people to play the game simultaneously, and it's quite a quick, simple little game, and it generated so much laughter as people were knocked out of the game until you got down to the last final two, and everybody was trying to cheer them on and trying to get them to go. And we had one guy who was there looking at his cards to play, trying them every which possible way to actually make them fit. He didn't win, but he was certainly the one who was really cheered on the most by how everybody was trying to back him to get him to work. But it just makes everybody all come together and work, even if you're not a gamer. It still livens things up and makes for a really interesting session. And it's not just that session. People are talking about it the day after, the week after. It's something that actually brings people together.
And I think one of the reasons why it's so good for scenarios like that is, typically icebreaker um, exercises in places like at work or in clubs or whatever. They tend to focus on you as an individual, like, well, "Hey, what's your name?" and we'll say something interesting about yourself, which just puts, like, I don't know about you guys, but it puts, like, the fear of God in me, like, oh, what's interesting, like, makes me question my own life, like, why am I interesting, what, I don't understand. Whereas the great thing about board games or tabletop games or whatever, or games in general, I suppose, is that you don't have to, you're all playing a game, so you think about the game, you don't really have to put yourself out there necessarily to play the game. You just play it, and as a result, through sort of osmosis, you might become more relaxed and therefore become more open to people, and just get chatting about the game, and then that could lead on to other things. And I think it's just a really natural way of encouraging communication in a group, and it's a lot better than your typical sort of ways that we're forced to communicate, especially in the office.
I think one of the things that really helps with that is a lot of games are like you can kind of choose how much you engage with other people, I guess, because you can like a lot of games you can choose if you want to just focus on the game itself and not engage with other people so much. Whereas other people might like readily go to the other extreme, like if they're quite gregarious, and like dive straight into like talking about things to do with it. And so I think that the ability to kind of have that spectrum is really useful. And also, yeah, like just having a common topic to talk about straight away rather than kind of trying to guess what things other people might be into. The matches what you're into, like makes it a lot smoother as well.
Yeah, and that also makes it, I think, some in certain scenarios, it makes it easier to make friends a little bit in when playing games, right? Because um, you immediately have something in common, which is that you're playing this game, whether that's whatever the game might be, and that point of conversation then can then easily lead to friendships, or not. Sometimes it's perfectly enjoyable to play with random strangers that you never talk to again. But you can still, the wonderful thing about it is you can sit down and play with those people and just have a bit of fun, even if you've never met that person.
Yeah, that's why the tabletop cafes are pretty good, because there are loads of people there that have like-minded interests. You know that they are tabletop gamers, and you know they'll play with you. Not all of them will, but someone will come up to you, like what you're playing, and want to join in. So that's always good to meet new people and kind of, I guess, do the social thing that some of us aren't very good at. I am very socially inept, and that's why I tend to focus on starting up, seeding these board game communities in the places I work, because it helps me to get myself out there, get myself out of my comfort zone, to meet new people, teach them how to play games, and then play games with them.
I wonder if we could go back to a little bit. It might not be as interesting to other people, but I think it's interesting. I want to go back into sort of some of the, I guess, scientific reasons why board games are good for us, especially when we're young. Because I've found some of this really really interesting for me personally. Because other than the basics, like learning to follow instructions, learning sort of maths and literacy, as we've talked to, problem solving. There's also like motor skills for certain games. I've got a game called Rhino Hero, which is I would highly recommend, by the way, especially for you, David, because it's a great one for kids. But the whole point is it's a bit like reverse Jenga, right? You're sort of building a tower up, like physically a tower up. So you've got to make sure that you're placing this little superhero rhino thing. You've got to place it sort of very very carefully, and so it helps with fine motor skills and balance, hand-eye coordination, all of that. I was reading something really interesting actually about how good games are for people with autism, because of the for most games, because it has a strict rule set, i.e. that very strict, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, any nuance is generally removed from most games, and so it's really easy for them to pick up and really easy for them to relax while playing them. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on like all these. There's so many. I guess it might be a question specifically for David, I suppose, but there's so many benefits that these games have for young people and developing people that I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily just me here, because I think we all started out quite young with tabletop. But yeah, for my children at least, it's much easier for me to see what's going on with them. And I can see there are certain things that they do that is helping with their self-confidence, with their understanding, and also with their patience. When you're very young, you have very little patience, and it's pretty obvious when they sit down and start screaming because something didn't work out for them. But tabletop slows things down for them, and it gets them to slow down with it. And that seems to help with them understanding when they need to take some time to think about a problem rather than just rush in and fail. And some games are better than others, but things like I'm just trying to think. My Little Scythe is a good example, where you've got objectives, and the objectives are pretty simple, and you've got a little fun aspect. You've got pie fighting going on, so that gives them a little interest, but it's not overly aggressive. It's not like you're playing Risk or something that involves tantrums that are probably going to ensue with a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old playing. but it teaches them a lot of the basics of actually being a fully fledged human being, rather than this little monster that kind of resides in our house.
One thing I actually forgot to mention was the fact that board games provides healthy competition, right? Like it can teach. It'd be interesting to get your thoughts on this because I see if I was ever to be a parent, I wouldn't. I don't think I'd ever like always lose to my child. I would try, maybe sometimes I'd go easy on them, to let them, win graciously as well as lose graciously. But I have heard in the past of people that always let their children win, and people that never. There's probably people out there that probably never let their kids win and just play as normal. And I just want, again, I think that's an interesting subject about like how. I see board games as a really good opportunity to teach kids that not everything's always going to go your way, right? In a very
Not
simple
everything is
way.
about winning.
Yeah, not everything's about winning, exactly. But I'm
Yeah.
not all parents necessarily see that, which I also find interesting.
I agree. My children are very competitive, and I'm trying to work on that aspect, but without. I don't want them to be playing games that are ultra competitive, because unfortunately those games make me ultra competitive, and I don't want them to get fed up with gaming because they keep losing to me. Not pulling my own chain. I've got a definite skill advantage on them through experience. But if you think about the games that we're talking about, things like My Little Scythe, it does have a competitive aspect, but you don't have to be aggressive with it. You don't have to be directly competing with each other in an aggressive manner. And that kind of allows me to relax a little bit, and then I just go with the flow. A lot of games I just play to play rather than playing to win. But things like Risk, I hate that game for a lot of reasons. But those games where it brings out that competitive nature, it's much harder for me to relax. I tend to be a lot more tense when I come to play that kind of game, which is interesting because I don't feel that way about Cthulhu Wars, even though it's a very similar kind of game. I think it's probably because the stress of the dice rolls is just not there.
And that's an interesting subject in itself, right? Like games that involve chance. I mean, obviously the obvious ones, might be gambling games, but also things like King of Tokyo and Risk, I suppose, in a sense. They provide a whole separate set of emotions and feelings that sometimes I would argue can be enjoyable. So I don't know what your thoughts on that are, guys.
Yeah, I can start with that. For me, it's a double-edged sword. It can be enjoyable, but if it's too much of that, it can fall into being a less enjoyable experience, shall we say? I think part of that is where I am in the spectrum, and when we're talking about autism and rules to follow, random kind of breaks out of that a little bit too much sometimes, and that starts to make you feel like the rules are not necessarily well defined.
I think it depends on how one of the things that I've learned about chance games anyway is a good sorry, it's going slightly off topic maybe, but a good chance game tends to be one where you have some kind of way to steer the odds, if that makes sense. So being able to re-roll, for instance, or having something, some kind of reward that lets you re-roll things. Risk is just like rolling, and so that I can definitely understand. It's just like lame, but like something like King of Tokyo, obviously you can re-rolls, you can buy cards that let you re-roll, you can gain, you can sort of tip the odds in your favor a little bit.
A great example of that is Gloomhaven with the cards, the deck. You can definitely sway that more into your favor, and that plays more to how I like games. With, like you say, that you can mitigate that risk. If you can mitigate that risk, then there's strategy involved, and strategy starts flicking the right switches in my head.
I think there's different types of randomness as well. So there's randomness before and after you act. So I guess so far the games we've talked about are mostly that second type, where you take an action and it has maybe one of two or more outcomes, and you don't know what it's going to be. But there's the other type of randomness as well, which I think can be quite interesting as well, which is before you act, like getting given a different scenario that maybe you didn't expect, and having to adapt and respond to that on the fly, which I think is another way that you can kind of balance a little bit between players at different experience levels, and it's maybe a bit more comfortable for people who like um like things to be like kind of nice and understandable and a bit more predictable, because when I do this, like, that will happen. So I'm thinking here of things like where maybe you're drawing from a deck for maybe enemies that you're going to fight or events that are going to happen, and then you have to act in response to that.
Yeah, I can see that. And that, again, is something that I quite enjoy in board games, because that brings, or tabletop games in general, I should say, because not all of them are board games, but that brings that variation as well. So it means that you might be drawn a different place, a different location. You'll be getting different sets of hands in things like Seven Wonders. It just adds that variety in. You've got to play to what you have, so you can strategize there, and that again flicks the right switches for me.
I think that's what gives sort of tabletop games that we would play probably the edge over, your chesses, your maybe not chess. That's a bad example, but like generic sort of card games in a standard 52 card deck, that sort of thing. Although there is a lot of randomness in terms of variation of cards that if you're playing poker, for instance, like the variation of cards is completely different, but I still feel like the replayability is maybe not there when you're playing almost the same thing over and over again. I can't. Maybe poker and chess were bad examples, but I'm trying to think.
Chess is a good example in some ways, in the, and I don't say this to suggest that either chess or other games are better than each other, but I think it's kind of interesting to think of how chess is a game of perfect information, and that it's a very interesting and deep game. But if you've got two people who are at very different experience levels, then one of them's going to have a bad time, for sure. Whereas with other games where there's variety, you can kind of mitigate that a bit, and you can also that variety does mean that the people, I guess I would include myself here, who like to kind of mix things up a bit and have different experiences rather than kind of returning to the same game every time. I find that a lot more exciting.
Yeah, but on the I suppose on the flip side, there is plenty of tabletop gamers who don't play a lot of I guess varied games. You'll get people who play a lot of Warhammer, and a lot of war games tend to sit in a category, I find, where there is variation, don't get me wrong, because you have different armies, but ultimately the rule book is very solid. There's not a huge amount of chance that can play into, like you were saying, there's not a huge amount of, you have two opponents and one opponent is probably going to get the better of the other one, and there's not, although Warhammer does have dice rolling in it, but yeah.
I would say that's a different kettle of fish again, because although you maybe don't have the unpredictability, I think most of the people I've known who've been into that sort of thing like to, make different terrain and have different experiences that way, and maybe vary army sizes and and army composition and things like that. But yeah, I think it's definitely true that it's the variety doesn't come from the randomness there.
No, but the creativity does. Not from the randomness, but I mean, there is creativity there. you've got, like you were talking about the terrain, you've got someone that's made that terrain. They've tried to make it look authentic to the feel of the environment, and they just kind of build on it from there. So there are different things that are going on that make that experience enjoyable, rather than it just being the random. That's a little bit mitigated through certain skill cards or through certain combinations of dice that make that a little bit more fun, a little bit less stressful.
And actually, sort of disagreeing with myself a little bit. One of the things with, I suppose, games like Warhammer as well, like they have a huge amount of flavour related to them. They've got this whole world built up around it, and so you can apply a lot of imagination and creativity to what is essentially could just be like a skirmish or a simple mission or whatever. So people that are deep in that lore can apply their own stories to those battles, right?
Yeah, there's even a lot of I mean, comparing to something like chess, I guess, because there's a lot more nuance to it, I guess, where you can kind of come up with strategies and tactics that are quite unusual. There's a lot, I guess, because the game that like war games tend to have a bigger scope. There's more room to kind of do things that are maybe a bit unexpected and creative, I think. No, not to say that you can't be creative playing chess.
It's true. We're not dissing on people who love playing chess. It's we mock what we're not good at, right? Well, yeah, and also like I think you get into the realms of RPG, right? That there's a huge amount of overlap there with certain games, and when it comes to one of the things I do like about certain games is it is the flavor, and it is the I think we've talked about it before, the sort of theatrics of it, if that makes sense. Like putting yourself in the story, as it were, which is more or less subtle depending on the game, and yeah, you can go from being just enjoying that the game is works very similar to how or sort of nods at real life, like Formula One, for instance. It has like tire wear and brake wear, so there's sort of a nod to how real physics work. And then you go all the way to the other extreme, which is of like Gloomhaven, which you can either play as, you can just play your cards and play it like a board game if you want to, or you could be, a bit more like what Dragon does, which is, have a kind of, mission log and listen to all the flavor text and all of that sort of stuff.
It's a complete blog write-up of the games, taken from the point of view of my character. It's basically like a diary of, so it's kind of like taking metagaming to the extreme. You're writing or producing a creative narrative about the game you've just played. So it's, instead of like crafting like terrain, which I do anyway, I've actually done it as more of like the creative narrative side, to write it up as an online diary that anybody can go read.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that I think in recent years, especially with the Legacy series and the Gloomhaven sort of series as well, it seems to be that we're moving more towards that kind of ongoing storytelling of building up characters. That seems to be more and more popular now, at least in among sort of regular gamers. One other thing that board games can be is educational, which obviously you can roll back to some kind of talk about mathematics or literacy or whatever, like we've said a few times already. But one of the things that I sort of while reading up on this, sort of working out what games why games are good, etc. One of the things I realised is there's quite a few games that, without even you knowing about it, can be incredibly educational. So one game that springs to mind is Wingspan, for instance. Like, all of the elements of Wingspan, all those birds in there are real birds. You can if you take the time, you can read the cards. You can know what part of the world that bird comes from, what kinds of food they eat in a way. Obviously, you have games that are perhaps a little bit more on the nose, like Timeline, where you literally put historical events in order of time. But it sort of occurred to me that there's some games that kind of sneak in bits and pieces that actually teach you a lot about the world without you really realizing it. Or maybe you have realized it, and I'm just the ignorant one.
I think the only answer to that is we need a game that will teach us that games can teach us things.
board game builder.
Well, there are
Board Game
board
Factory.
games about board games. So I backed one on Kickstarter called Shelfie Stacker, which is basically you stacking your shelves with board games.
That sounds perfect. I mean, maybe that leads into an element of enjoyment about board games, and that is the kind of collection element. One of the things that a lot of there are a lot of hobbies do result in forming a collection of some sorts, and I know for me it provides me quite a lot of enjoyment of collecting games and having a variety of games on my shelf. And one thing that happens every now and again that I do actually find quite relaxing is just organizing them into relevant. I don't have a very strict system. Maybe I should play that game and work out what if I have a better system. But yeah, there's
So
an element of
you can organize it alphabetically. You can organize it by the colors of your boxes. You could do all sorts of things with it.
Yeah, and I think in a weird sort of sense to people like us, I think that provides a lot of enjoyment as well. Organizing, actually, yeah, for me, especially in lockdown, where I've sort of been in a place where I don't want to buy too many more games because I might not necessarily play them. One of the things I've been turning to is how I organize my games, and there's an element of enjoyment there where I have, the easier it is to pick a game out and set it up and then to pack it away at the end, then the more enjoyment I get out of that experience, I suppose, as a whole. So I'm just it's like opening a box just chock full of different things to enjoy.
Yeah, then we've got painting minis that, when we don't play grey, we're trying to paint up all our minis to be more thematic. And that's another enjoyable experience in itself. It's a completely separate hobby, but it's one that brings value to your tabletop hobby.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, so it's just occurred to me, one of the things I've always wanted to try actually is, I don't know, it's a bit like a game. I'm sure David knows of a game jam. I've heard of tabletop stores or tabletop, board game cafes, etc. I've heard of them. I've never taken part in one myself, but one of the things I've heard about is sort of game jams. So where you all split up into groups and you basically have X amount of time to create a game, and I can see an element of enjoyment in that as well. Like, that's something I've always wanted to try and do, is just to sort of create my own, and I think there's a rewarding element to that as well.
Yeah, I agree. I believe Dragon was actually making a game at some point.
I've actually got 2 games that are in the works. It's kind of been put on hold because I haven't been able to get together with people to actually play test them. But yeah, I've got a couple of car games that are almost ready for play test. So when I next see you, hopefully we'll be able to get something done. But yeah, it is another enjoyable aspect of the game itself.
What kind of things I don't know, what kind of things does that entail? Like, how did you decide to start making it, and what elements of it? Is there any particular elements of it that made it enjoyable for you?
Well, I mean, I've always had an interest in science fiction, so my one of the games is based on alien races, and I'm using kind of a new concept that I haven't seen any other game done. Whereas when you actually choose your starting cards, you actually get dealt a number of cards, but then you have to discard some of the cards. And some of the cards that you discard, they could be high value cards, but it gives you a good set of other cards to actually play the game with. So you could be throwing away a very good position to actually get good playability with the game. Or you could hold on to those cards but have a limited playability within the game. So it's kind of an odd concept that I haven't seen any other game use. So it's just something I wanted to kind of try out and work on. But the other thing is, I mean, I asked you guys for the naming of the races, and I was just looking at ways of actually just jazzing up the kind of names of these alien races and just making it kind of interesting that way. So there's a lot of things that make it interesting in the actual game creation process itself.
Yeah, I mean, I actually haven't done a lot of playtesting myself, but it is something that I've wanted to try out, because I imagine there's an element of enjoyment there as well in trying something that is completely new. And okay, there might be things where they've borrowed mechanics or elements from other games or whatever, but I can imagine that one of the coolest things I thought about UK Games Expo was the fact that we were sat there like playtesting games that were brand new and not necessarily on the shelves yet, and there's an element there of holy moly, this is a brand new game that's never been played before, or hasn't been played by many people before, let's say. And this is doing something new and it's enjoyable. And I can imagine that I'm sure there are experiences that go the other way, and you go, I never want to play this game again. But there's also, I'm sure there's an enjoyment there of being like, oh wow, this is a brand new thing this is gonna do
That's
well.
one of the good things of having conventions and large groups of people, of like-minded individual, to get together. You can actually get your game in front of people and gauge their opinion on it, as in, would this be something that's enjoyable to play? Now, I've had that at Dragon Meet when I went to see some of the new games there. There was one guy there who's got this new card game where you actually had to hang on to your cards and have certain parts of your body touching the cards. So you've got to have you've got to have your finger always on one card, or you've got to be touched on your ear or something like that. And I was thinking of this, and I think, yeah, it'd be a good game for kids, but for me, it's pretty much, no, I don't like this sort of thing. So you can actually get a good idea of how good a game would be and how much of an impact it would have.
And what sort of target audience that you might want to, although you didn't necessarily enjoy it, they might take that on board and then therefore market it towards kids, etc. But yeah, and that's also
the whole point of having these sort of kind of gatherings and of like-minded people. You get a lot of enjoyment out of it, and you can actually gauge how other people see your games or how you see other people playing your games.
Yeah, you definitely can gauge things like difficulty, time takes to play, the age range of the audience that you're targeting, and then refine it for those characteristics. I think it's, like I say, it's one of those great things about tabletop conventions in general, or tabletop meetups actually, because you've got board game cafes, you've got tabletop meetups like Tabletop Tuesday in London, and those things all bring lots of like-minded people together. It's a fantastic place to play new games, experience new things together with other people that have also not experienced it, and be taught by someone that knows it or actually created the game.
And then you also have the element of, as we talked a lot about in our last episode, digital, gaming and digital board games. and sorry, not in our last one, the one before, but anyway, one of our podcasts, we talked a lot about digital board games, and you know, the amazing thing about these platforms like Tabletop Simulator, etc. You can build a mod for your game, and you can do the same thing that you can get the same thing out of what you'd get at a convention with people on the internet, and you can play it through. You can all do all the playtesting that you want to do, and also get the enjoyment of playing games with other people. And I know that Tabletop Simulator is definitely something that people do use for playtesting, because you can probably reach a even wider audience than you might be able to at like a gaming convention. I know, for instance, we've been approached by some guys making a game called Mutually Assured Destruction, I think it is. And they do all their playtesting through Tabletop Simulator, because they got people all over the world playing it. And again, that's the digital element of board games. Also, is another reason that makes board games so good, and the hobby so good, is that again, the versatility and the flexibility of how you can play and who you play with, etc. And yeah,
I think I showed you an example of Drander games as well, with Solar Sphere, which isn't related to Solar Storm at all, other than it's made by the same developer and it has a similar name. But it's, it's like you say, it's that versatility, that being able to reach a worldwide audience via a virtual medium that makes tabletop gaming in general such a great thing. You don't have to do it physically, but you can, and it's a great experience when you do.
Right. Well, I think we've had a pretty good discussion on what we think makes the tabletop gaming hobby a great one. If you've got any thoughts of your own, make sure that you tweet them at Moody Meeple, or comment on the YouTube video when it goes live. Again, apologies for the late upload of the last episode. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and thanks to Dragon, David, and Tom for joining me, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.